Professor Siseko Kumalo is an associate professor at the Ali Mazrui Center for Higher Education at the University of Johannesburg. Professor Kumalo, good afternoon to you and thank you for your time. There have been so many problems with NSFAS over the years. It's received a huge amount of attention. I would like to think many of those problems have been fixed. Are you feeling quite confident that they're running on track for this year?
Good afternoon, Stephen, and good afternoon to the viewership. I think the statement that we heard from NSFAS this morning indicates a certain level of stabilization of the organization that is NSFAS, which is quite useful. Are we out of the clear completely at this particular point in time? I'm not too sure. I wouldn't necessarily want to hedge my bets on that. But there is a definite indication of administrative normalization and procedural clarity, as well as a shift from emergency response to system governance, which is quite useful and I think will bode well for us as we go into the 2026 academic year, which will result, I think, in lesser disruptions across the sector in terms of the start of the academic year.
So if it was a boat that capsized, you finally get it right again, it still rocks a little bit, but for that rocking is coming down and now it's starting to slowly move ahead?
100%. And, you know, Stephen, I think quite a lot of newsrooms tend to report annually on the disruptions to the start of the academic year because of late registration, and late registration comes as a result of late payments to the beneficiaries of NSFAS, which of course has incredible knock-on effects for the academic year throughout the sector. So I do think that from what we've seen from today's briefing, we're seeing an indication that there is some hope for the 2026 academic year. Will that hope persist into the second semester? Because you will recall that a lot of the issues sort of start with the first semester registrations, and then we have a second bout in the middle of the year when we move into the second semester. I'm hopeful, but as I say, I wouldn't hedge my bet on the fact that we are finally at, I suppose, clear sails, as it were. I'm hopeful, however, that this year will be far better.
It's quite a big thing that we're doing. What we're doing is we're, as government, asking people to apply for money. That money, they need to be looked at, they need to be checked in various ways. Do they need the money? Did they get the place? That needs to be sorted out with the institution, and then the payments need to be made. I mean, on one level, it's incredibly complicated and technical. On another level, it's what our banks do on a daily basis with very little problem. I do wonder sometimes if we've got the right format, because what government is doing is to educate young people who can't pay for it, which is probably the majority of our young people, I'm afraid to say. We're paying both the institution, your universities and your higher education and all the rest get money, and then you're also paying the students. I do wonder sometimes if there's an easier way to do it.
There could be an easier way to do it, Stephen, but I do think that, one of the things that often doesn't get talked about is how NSFAS is funded, both from National Treasury, but also I think what the government's push has been to kind of get previous beneficiaries to actually pay back into the system so that we can continue to fund more students. And in that way, I think one of the challenges that NSFAS still faces is around the verification, specifically of details of applicants who are coming into the system to, be beneficiaries for the first time. That is a major challenge that I think still needs to be sorted out, because you do have, for example, people who are coming into the system and who are benefiting from the system that don't necessarily qualify to benefit for the system. And there's also often a funding shortfall in terms of NSFAS. However, from the briefing that was held today, some of those budgetary constraints were not necessarily raised, which is indicative of the fact that probably NSFAS does have the budget for the vast majority of the students who are coming into the higher education space. However, as you rightfully indicate, there could be ways of streamlining. Could there be, for example, as you rightfully indicate, a conversation between NSFAS systems with the banking system in the country? There is that possibility. I'm not too sure, however, whether they are open to those kinds of conversations. But definitely inefficiencies could be reduced in the system, specifically when it comes to beneficiaries and the loss of funding that goes to individuals who don't necessarily qualify.
As a society, we spend quite a lot of money on higher education. We spend a huge amount of time talking about it. And we talk about it, I think, for a couple of reasons. One is, and this is quite a boring geographic reason, that some of the higher education institutions are very close to where broadcast newsrooms are, and there are many of them in Joburg. Another is that as a society, I think all of us, whether we admit it or not, aspire to having our children go to university, especially if no one in our family has ever gone to university ourselves. You know, that makes people really look at what's happening to students very closely. Are we getting a proper return on investment for what we're spending on higher education? I realize I might sound like a heretic when I say that, but are we actually getting what our society should be getting for the amount of money that we're spending on the sector?
I do think there is a need or a gap that still needs to be filled between, for example, what the market needs and what universities are teaching. However, Stephen, I must be clear not to speak as a person who's talking about quote unquote university training as necessarily aligned to market demands, because that would necessarily mean that institutions are now servicing the market, whereas universities specifically are training students in critical thinking, cultivating useful skills that can go beyond, say, for example, a BCom accounting degree. So that doesn't necessarily mean that individuals who do BCom accounting will all land up in banking. You find, for example, a lot of the folks who are in banking come from engineering backgrounds. So a person will have done a BSc in engineering, and then they'll end up, for example, in one of the leading banks in the country. So that is indicative. The point that I'm trying to make, to get across there, is to say that insofar as a person will, for example, train in one particular specialization, they might end up in the job market in a completely different sector than they might have trained for initially, which is to say that institutions are tasked, specifically universities are tasked with training for critical skills and the applicability of those critical skills. It's a different conversation when we get to the TVET sector, for example, where you're going to have basic skills, carpentry, boiler making, etc. And I do think that that's an underinvestment that, as the Department of Higher Education and Training, we're not yet fully cultivating, insofar as if you think about the number of shortages in terms of critical skills that our economy needs for the right development. So I would agree with you to a certain extent to say that we might not necessarily be getting as much value as we would need, precisely because of how the public discourse has framed what it means for an individual to hold a university qualification. A lot of folks often have a very, I would say, outdated perspective, which is to think about the fact that if I've trained to be an engineer, I should get into an engineering job. And that's not necessarily the articulation that we see in the sector going into the job market.
I mean, so many people in other countries, in parts of Europe, in Australia, in the UK, talk about how the richest people they know are often plumbers or electricians. And I sometimes think that's beginning to happen here because there's such a shortage. And in previous conversations with people in that sector, they say, actually, you can find people who will be apprentice electricians, but very few people will train to become a plumber.
Absolutely, Stephen. And that's the problem, is that we have a real shortage of critical skills in the economy. And I do think that one of the issues around that is the fact that there's been an overemphasis, for example, on university education. And as I say, university education is not going to train you for a job in, the day that you walk across that stage and you get your qualification. With a university qualification, you're going to get skills that you're going to apply, whether you're applying them in that particular sector that you've trained in or you're applying them in a different particular sector. So what would, I think, be a useful move going forward, and I do quite appreciate the fact that TVET colleges are part and parcel of the beneficiaries of NSFAS funding in terms of the students that get to receive that funding, is that we would need to capacitate the TVET sector to be able to train plumbers, boilermakers, welders, carpenters, folks who will be able to staff an economy that would otherwise be growing, because we've also got to realize the fact that the South African economy has been stagnant for quite some time. So once you create the job opportunities, you do need folks who will be able to take up those opportunities with the requisite skills.
Professor, thank you so much. Professor Siseko Kumalo is an associate professor at the Ali Missouri Center for Higher Education at the University of Johannesburg. President